Today, I want to talk about one of the most important questions when it comes to interpreting the Bible, and how does the Old Testament relate to the New Testament? Today, we're going to talk about that question with somebody who studied this for many years. Hello, welcome to Clarity and Brevity. Today, I'm going to talk with Ben Glad, Dr. Benjamin Glad, who has done a lot of work on what we call biblical theology, or more specifically, even the New Testament use of the Old Testament. So, Ben, welcome back to the channel.
How's it going, Brandon? It's so good to be here.
So, for those who are just coming to this conversation or for the first time, perhaps, or maybe they are familiar with it and would like to learn more, what do we mean when we talk about the New Testament use of the Old Testament, and why is that important?
Yeah, so by studying the New Testament's use of the Old, that in other words, how do the apostles read the Old Testament? We can learn, number one, what they thought about the Old Testament, number two, how they related to Christ, and number three, how we relate to that story as well. There are over 350 Old Testament quotations in the New, and probably, I think the number is between 3 to 4,000 Old Testament allusions in the New Testament. In fact, in the book of Revelation, there are about 500 allusions to the Old Testament. Each verse, some of the verses will have 2 or 3 allusions to the Old Testament. So it's absolutely everywhere. And so to not read the Old Testament in light of the New is to not read the Old Testament this way, or even the New Testament in light of the Old, is to really sever this huge link between the two testaments.
As a practical observation, the Old Testament is much bigger than the New Testament, which perhaps says something about the importance of the Old Testament for the New Testament.
Yes, that's exactly right. What is also a fascinating field, and this is huge, it's absolutely ginormous. It's so big, it's difficult for even scholars who spend their whole careers working on it. And that is the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. That is Isaiah's use of Exodus, Isaiah's use of Genesis, Ezekiel's use of the Pentateuch. These are ginormous, because what's happening now is that even the last 2 decades, Old Testament scholars are starting to see these allusions and these connections more clearly. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Old Testament dissertations waiting to be written that will develop some of this stuff. And that's just the Old and the Old. We haven't even gotten to the New Testament use of the Old.
And so it's a massive field, and it can be hard to get one's foot in the door, perhaps, and get a sense for all of this lay of the land. Can you give maybe an example or two for some New Testament passages that might use the Old Testament, and how that is so important for understanding the meaning of that passage?
Right. So before I put my finger on an example, I want to point something out here, that what we're doing enriches the text. It doesn't overturn traditional readings. I think a lot of people are scared about that we're going to say something that's just over the top or heterodox. No, we're enriching the text. So we're taking what is traditional and seeing depth there. For example, there's so many of these, it's hard to find a good one. I was thinking about Mark 9 in the Transfiguration there, and there are a number of allusions, textual allusions to the Exodus account. This idea about Moses even going up to the mountain, and then we have a couple allusions built into when the father says to the son, "You are my beloved son." That's at least 2 allusions. Genesis 22:2, that's when Abraham tells Isaac that he is his beloved son. And then Psalm 2:7, when God tells the Messiah, God tells the king that he is his son too. So those 2 allusions right there really shed light on Jesus' identity. There, one would be he is the ultimate sacrifice, and then the other one would be his kingship. But I think what's so fascinating is these allusions that we get, they're combined. How Genesis 22 2, this notion of a sacrifice, is combined with Psalm 2:7. That is a very kingly and royal text. So do you see what these New Testament authors are doing? They're taking texts, even 2 different themes, two different trajectories. One is suffering, one sacrifice, and then the other one is royalty, messianic expectations, something like that. And they're pulling these threads together in unusual ways. And so by studying the Old Testament, we can start to see these unique trajectories really kind of blend very well for us.
And your own PhD work was on First Corinthians, and you've written about mystery from Daniel, things that were hidden and are now revealed. Maybe can you say a word about that unfolding process in the New Testament when it comes to the New Testament use of the Old Testament?
Right. So this is an area that continues to interest me. I've thought a lot about this in for a couple of decades, and I feel like I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. One of the ways, now it's not the only way, but it's an important way in which New Testament authors are reading the Old Testament. And that is they're seeing things in the Old Testament that the original audience did not see. Now that doesn't mean that they weren't there. It means that these layers of meaning were hidden from them. I do think they had some sense. The Old Testament authors had some sense, but the meaning was not fully revealed until we get to the New Testament. So, as I was just mentioning, the way in which Christ's death and his reign come together so pointedly in the Gospels, that is a unique revelation, that is in some sense, a fresh revelation that the New Testament point their fingers on. In fact, to even push that a little bit further would also be Jesus' identity as God. So here you have Jesus is not only the Messiah, well, he's a suffering Messiah. That's unique. Whose ministry doesn't simply include a little bit of suffering, but a lot of suffering. It's what he does best. But not only do you have that, you then also have this idea that he is in fact God all the while. So the way that this is pulled together, we would say it's mysterious, it's unique, it's unexpected, all the while. Now here it is, still fulfilling the Old Testament. Do you see? In Paul's eyes, in the apostles' eyes, they don't see a contradiction here. It's unique, it's unexpected, but yet it's still fulfilling the Old Testament. And the word mystery sort of pulls all that together for us. So one would be kingdom. And most of what Jesus is talking about in the Gospels is kingdom. And the way that we get it, the way that Jesus discusses this, especially in Matthew 13, which is probably I think that's the essence. And if you were to ask me what passage in the Bible talks more about the nature of the kingdom, I think it's in Matthew 13. And in Matthew 13, he starts talking about these dimensions of the kingdom that were unexpected. They still fulfill the Old Testament, but they're unexpected. He talks about how both believers and unbelievers live at the same time of the eternal kingdom, the end time kingdom. That's odd. Another one is, hey, the kingdom's here, but it's small, just like a mustard seed. Eventually it will take over. At Christ's coming, it will take over. But it starts off small and then it grows. Another one is how, and here it is how suffering is part of the kingdom, and this is ironic and paradoxical. How when a believer suffers, the kingdom grows, and it not only does it grow, but it's an evidence of the kingdom. That doesn't seem like it makes sense in light of the Old Testament. But I think once you start reading the Bible well, putting the pieces together, you start to see these themes that are woven. They may be separate in the Old Testament, but the New Testament kind of puts them together. We could list all sorts of themes, but those are a couple.
All right. Yeah. Now, can you give some practical tips for somebody? You've done a lot of work on this, making it accessible to people. How can somebody get started in learning more about how the New Testament uses the Old Testament? What are some resources?
It's going to be your cross references. That's going to be the number one. What's difficult about cross references is that when you look at them in your Bible, the cross references, they will make a distinction between a quotation. So sometimes the cross reference may be like in italics or something, but when it comes to allusions and then these conceptual parallels, they're all lumped together. and it frustrates readers. It's very difficult. In fact, even so, the gold standard here is a Nestle. It's a Greek text, the Nestle-Aland 27 or 28. Do you have that by your side? Is that
Yeah,
in
let me
your?
find it.
Do you keep that in your pocket, Brandon? I keep mine in my pocket at all times.
Here it is, right here on my desk.
There it is. Is that 28? Is that 28?
That's 28. Yeah.
That's 28. Yeah. It's partially revised. I think the full edition comes out. Yeah, there you go. Look at those cross references. They're the best. They really are the best. However, and I've found that even in the Nestle-Aland, which is the gold standard, there are times when it conflates allusion and parallel. And I didn't used to think that, but now that I've kind of gone through the whole NA28's cross references, I don't trust them for marking out allusions like I used to. So I'm a little mixed there. So start with there. The ESV cross references are really good. The NASB, the NIV, the CSB. I think again, this is so frustrating too, is that there are different lists. So the ESV will have some text, NIV will have others. Where do you go? There's not a standard here, and I think that's what's frustrating. So that's a tip, but you're going to notice that it's a frustrating tip. The other one is, in fact, just as an aside, this is why in the CSB Study Bible that I'm putting together with Greg Beale, we're revising cross references so that when the reader opens their Bible, all the allusions will be flagged in the body of the text. They'll be in italics, and then they'll be in blue font. And then in the margins, we will list those allusions that are found in that passage. It'll be very easy to say, oh, that's a quotation. Oh, that's an allusion, and here are the texts. It shouldn't be that hard, but it really is that hard. And then to use that Beale and Carson commentary that Baker published about 15 years ago I still think it's unmatched. The commentary. I think using your cross references and then the commentary, it's going to really cover all the bases that you need. To take it to the next level would be to look at a pretty robust, individual commentary at that point. I mean, you could probably even use Beale's like Biblical Theology and look at some of his scripture indices and see where because he's constantly pointing out allusions. That would be another source for that.
Yeah, and now this can still feel so overwhelming because there's 27 books in the New Testament, all these hundreds or thousands of allusions. But maybe just very practically, let's say someone's reading through Matthew. Now, there may be debates about allusions, and we should pay attention to them. But if you read through Matthew, he's actually going to tell you this comes from the Old Testament and quote the Old Testament. So go back to that passage. It will tell you somewhere in the Bible where that comes from. Like Matthew 1, he quotes Isaiah 7:14. So go back to Isaiah 7 and read that passage and read helps on that passage if you need to, and then go back and read Matthew, read the Old Testament passages in their context. But even just that simple step, right, of reading through the New Testament and taking the time to go back to the Old Testament when it's obvious will be helpful.
That's exactly right. And I've been doing this for a long time. Other people have been doing it longer, but the more you do it, the better you get. And 95-ish%, maybe even higher, it's not that hard. These are, even with quotations and allusions, the vast majority of them are not difficult. It's only a handful quotations and allusions that give us, okay, we aren't quite sure, but we need to trust the New Testament authors here. We aren't quite sure how they're tracing this out, but 97% we can figure out really what they're doing.
Yeah, that's helpful. So it's certainly important that as you think about how the Old Testament and New Testament relate, we need to know that they are unified over around one story of redemption. And as you look for resources, look at your Bible. Ben has done some other resources, such as editing a series of books called Essential Studies in Biblical Theology. And now he's working on New Studies in Biblical Theology, which is even a step up from that. There's this commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. Also, the dictionary. I don't know if we mentioned that in this video. The dictionary of the New Testament use of the Old Testament. There's a lot of resources out there. But
Beale's Handbook, Handbook it shows you this is how you do it. Here are the major ways New Testament authors cite the Old. that's and then Greg Lanier has one, which is pretty much summarizes Beale. Lanier's a little bit more accessible. That's published by Crossway maybe a year or two ago.
Yeah, is it called Old Made New? I think that's the name of it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
It's important that when you're reading the New Testament, to summarize, you also pay attention to the Old Testament and understand how what they're talking about in the New Testament is the fulfillment of the hopes of the Old Testament centered on Christ. Any final words on this, Ben?
You know, and this is a piece that my students, they've never considered this, and that is, not everything. New Testament authors don't always read text promise fulfillment or redemptive historically. Sometimes, in fact, very often, I don't have a percentage here. I think it's probably 20 to 30% of the time, they're just saying, oh, hey, there's a principle at work. There's a moral or ethical principle at work in the Old Testament, and God required it then, and he's requiring it now. That happens probably 20 to 30% of the time. More, they're not thinking in terms of typology at that moment, not thinking in terms of promise fulfillment, or no. They're just extracting a principle that was found in the Old Testament that they want, that is reaffirmed in the New.
So there's a number of different ways.
There are different. Or here's another one, and that is irony. So there are times in the New Testament where the New Testament author is saying the exact opposite thing as the Old Testament. And so some scholars say, oh, look, mistake, or this New Testament author doesn't know what he's doing. Or does he, right? He intentionally it actually proves the contextual nature. He takes something and he completely flips it, that which preserves the meaning of the Old Testament, but it's so striking in what it's doing. It just, we get this a fair amount as well. We'll get these inverted meanings. We find them all over the place.
Yeah. So the takeaway here is to understand how the whole Bible fits together, we need to look at the whole Bible.
The whole Bible, right.
So thanks, Ben, for sharing some of your experience with this, with the channel. Hope this has been helpful. Remember to keep it clear and focus on Christ.